Okay, and what's up, everybody? Welcome. So today is going to be a fantastic video. We're going to cover some very out there topics. I think some very advanced, maybe one might call them spiritual in nature, some concepts that we're going to share here today. So I'm really excited. This is going to be a really cool video. But before we get into any of that, the first thing we want to do is a little bit of a Valsalva squeeze maneuver, okay? So what we're going to do together is we're going to take our big deep breath in. We're going to hold that in, and then we're going to squeeze it with our diaphragm, with our chest, and we're going to hug our vagus nerve together, and we're going to feel that rush of acetylcholine all the way to our brain. It's going to feel really good, really fun, really awesome. Great way to start the day, okay? So ready? Let's do it together. In 3, 2, 1, breathe in. And then you can take a sip at the top. Now hold, and then you can kind of push your air against your lips, but without letting any air out. So and exhale. Feeling that beautiful feeling, that universal peace, that awareness, that really calm, beautiful sensation. Really, that is like the pinnacle of having your vagus nerve stimulated. It is so fantastic. It's so magical. I feel like I'm on a cooking show, and I'm trying to describe to you the food I just ate and tell you how good it is. And you can't really know until you try it. But the good news is, with the Valsalva squeeze that we just did, is that you can do it yourself over on your end. So you can experience your own cuisine of the vagus nerve. So I hope you were able to enjoy that simultaneous squeeze that we just did. So, all right, so let's kick into it. So what is the topic about today? At the core, the very, very top piece of the puzzle for what we're going to talk about, generally speaking, why it matters is it's going to cover the field of what we like to refer to as manifestation. Manifestation means, how do thoughts and intentions manifest themselves into base reality? How do you set an intention here in your mind and then see that intention realized out into the world around you? Funny story. So if you go to my personal Facebook account, you can go. If you go to my personal Facebook account, I've been, over the last 5 or 6 days, been sharing an unfolding, really fun story about how in 2016, on Valentine's Day, I was rear-ended on the freeway. Not my fault. It was the other guy's fault 100%, and it really sucked. It caused me a lot of neck issues. It was not fun. Really just not a good experience, to say the least. So ultimately, what I had to do was I had to basically reorient my work at the time. I was just back from China doing development with ultrasound, doing arrays in Silicon Valley with a startup doing ultrasound stimulation of the brain, and having that kind of a massive car accident and the impact to my head and the neck and all the pain I had made it really difficult to show up and work those 16-hour days that I was doing it at the age of 27 at the time. So my workload went from I built a business on a 16-hour workday, and then now could only work about a 1-hour workday. So things became radically more difficult for me. So at the time, I actually had a really great mentor, still have this mentor, but also had him then too. And he taught a lot about the benefit of presence, the benefit of being in your intuition and letting reality unfold from a deeper space than just cognitive thinking, and desiring and wanting and needing things, and just kind of going with an intuitive flow. And that was really powerful training for me. It was powerful mentorship. What happened was, in that time, even though I was dealing with a neck injury and the car accident and, having been rear-ended on the freeway and just, car accident's never fun. It's just going to throw a lot of stuff out of whack. But what I learned to do was more to trust my intuitive, innate sense of being and my innate sense of direction. And I started living from that in 2016 rather than where I was, which was just like push, 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 goal, 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 get, get, get. And even though I switched out of what I thought was the right way to do it, right? Because I was told, I was indoctrinated with the idea that you got to set goals. And if you don't have big goals and you're not like ridiculously obsessed with your goal, then you're not going to get good outcomes in life. And I was afraid that if I didn't perform to some standard, that I would be missing out. And if I missed every perfect little thing, then I would be screwed in a lot of ways. And so I lived on that for a long time. And in 2016, when I had to radically revamp my time and my energy, I learned about kind of manifestations in a sense. And yeah. Oh, cool. Kimberly, hey, good to see you, by the way. Wow. Awesome. That's fantastic. I love to hear that. I love to learn more, hear how you've been. It's been a long time. When was it you joined the program? Was like 2019 or 2020 or something like that? Anyway, getting back to the purpose of today's video is just this idea of like manifestation doesn't have to be hard. Creating reality from what you imagine, what you envision, doesn't have to be like butting up against a brick wall all the time. And there are some principles or methodologies or frameworks or models that you can observe the world through that can help you perceive things in a slightly different way, that can be extremely powerful to help you navigate the world, even if things have gone sideways for you a little bit. And I like this topic, especially in this group, because, I'm one of many admins of many Facebook groups where we deal with chronic illness and people who are, who have gotten sick. Something happened. They got Lyme disease. They got an autoimmune condition. They're just worried. They're just concerned that their life, it may be ruined. I think people do. When they develop an illness, they think, well, maybe my life is over. And you see that much in the Facebook groups. And so I want to remind people is that no matter what type of disaster has befallen you, is that there are always some key steps that you can take to get back on track. And as long as you're taking that step, it doesn't really matter what step you're on. It just matters that you're making the steps. And it's more about the process, the systems of trying, of doing, of showing up for certain things in life that can make all the difference, even if you're in an impaired state from chronic illness. So I think manifestation is especially useful, popular, important, especially if you're dealing with a chronic illness. So that's kind of the main purpose of even including the word manifestation. We all know what manifestation means, so I won't go into that too much, right? We all have a general sense of to manifest a reality. I want to be a parent. So you get married, you have children, you want to start a business, you learn how to start a business, and you launch a business, and you take on clients, and you make money, right? That's like the manifestation process. Now, going to another higher level than just like manifestation, there is a theory, a model that's considered almost a spiritual model. I think it's when I want to put together a nicely fitting puzzle for you that when the pieces click together, I do want you to go, oh, wow. Like, man, that helps me see something really powerful. Like something clicked in your mind. That's what I want to provide from this explanation. So trust me, there's a lot to do with the vagus nerve in this particular context. And hopefully we'll make that make sense. So there's a theory that was released or publicized in about 2003 called, I think it was 2003 or 2008, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was a theory called reality transurfing from a gentleman named Vadim Zeland. He's a Russian author, prior to the whole Russian mix up here, it doesn't matter. Reality Transurfing was supposed to be a book on the secrets of the universe, and it got a kind of a cult following. A lot of people read it. A lot of people were like, wow, this is some pretty esoteric, like occult kind of knowledge. And I was introduced to it from a business associate, and he's like, you know what, there's this book, it's called Reality Transurfing, you could check it out. Some people get it, some people don't. It's really just meant for the people who it jives with. And so I picked it up, and I was not expecting much, but I was like, wow, this book, Reality Transurfing, is pretty cool. I have it right here behind me. It's that rainbow colored large book. There's 5 books in the series. You can get it on Amazon. So the book itself, that book you can get for $38 or something like that. But the original print, the first English print book of book number 1, there's 5 main books, but just one book from the original printing on Amazon is about $140, $150. So just for a pretty small book with 13 or so chapters in it. So that says, when I see a book that's that in demand, tells me something about kind of something's happening around that book. And so anyway, I've actually purchased and gifted that book to some important people in my life, just to say, that I see the value of you as a person, and I see the value in this book. I hope you get something from it. So you don't have to spend the $150 for the book. You can just buy the actual textbook version of it, and it's absolutely fantastic. So Reality Transurfing is a large theory on many different topics, things about the space of variation. So in manifestation, what you do is you take your thought form and you focus on a place in the future, on a thought location, and you resonate your mind with an idea or an object. And as you focus on something in the future, you envision a coordinate space in the space of variations of all things that can happen and all things that could be. And if you focus enough on it, you will follow a certain timeline, and you'll align your body and your forward momentum through space and time to align with that becoming true, so to speak, that becoming something that exists. And so you are a conscious entity that has the ability to move towards what you envision, what you think about will resonate with a space of the non-existent. So you can, in essence, you can bring forth things that don't physically exist, don't materially exist yet, but do exist in the idea space, the non-physical. So that's a core piece of Reality Transurfing. Then there's this idea which is where the vagus nerve definitely comes from, and this is the idea called pendulums. You'll notice in the thumbnail of this video, there's a pendulum kind of hitting other marbles, like a marble or a steel ball pendulum that you would put on a desk. So that whole idea of a swinging pendulum. If you think about a pendulum has sort of its own center of gravity, let's say. You model complex behavior of planets spinning around other planets, or moons spinning around a planet, or planets spinning around the sun, and it has this kind of like pulsation, periodicity, and it's a pendulum. So pendulums in the Reality Transurfing model talk a lot about how groups of people, if they collectively all together think towards a thought form in the future, because you can have one individual person thinking about a non-existent thing in the space of variations and manifesting that thing towards them to create that into reality. But if you have multiple people doing it at the same time, you get something that emerges called a pendulum. And the pendulum is this idea that if you have more than one person, if you just have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 100 or 1,000 people all keeping in mind like a thought form or an entity in a sense, or an idea or a religion or a form of government or a video game or a TV show like Friends or whatever, if you have multiple minds kind of radiating their thought energy back and forth between something that doesn't exist, that you get something that becomes more powerful than just the collective people. You also get what's called a pendulum that now reexerts its energy back onto the people who are sending their energy into it. So it's kind of esoteric for sure, but it has to do with like, I think a good example are like religions I think are a good example of how pendulums could work. So let's say Christianity. I'm not going to be insensitive towards any religion here. I'm just going to pick out one for instance. I'm not asking you to believe in it. I don't really care what you particularly believe. This is just for demonstration purposes only. So let's say you have something like Christianity. I'm not claiming to be an expert on the religion or anything like that, but in that idea of Christianity, you have multiple people praying in synchronization at certain times of the day with certain words and patterns and rhythmic music, and they're reflecting and sending almost their own thought energy up to a thought form, like, God or Jesus Christ or the Lord or whatever they call it. But this collective group of people are resonating thought energy into the religion as a whole, to Christianity. And then, what we observe in these large collective thought form systems is a group of people who seem to almost become possessed by their own religion. And they start to almost behave in a way that can seem counterintuitive to the survival of an individual. Sometimes when you have a large collective group, there can be a certain kind of madness that emerges. You see people getting into demonic possession and they think that they have to do exorcisms, and there's all kinds of interesting rituals that can sort of co-develop and co-spawn with a religious order. And that whole idea behind what a pendulum represents is this idea that if you have enough people, if you think of an individual person as one pendulum swinging, like a pendulum like this, and then you have multiple pendulums like swinging together, like on this level, then what you do is you kind of create the interacting pattern between the two pendulums, and you think of a third larger pendulum that like almost hovers above them. Now, anytime you have enough momentum on the pendulum, and then one person who you call them adherents, people who adhere to the religious belief or to the thought form, as soon as one person begins to pull away from that pendulum and starts to doubt or not feed the energy to the pendulum as much, that's when the pendulum goes on to high alert and says, uh-oh, because the larger pendulum depends on the energy fed into it by the adherents, the people who believe in it, the people who pray to it, the people who, create the energy around it. The pendulum itself, not the individual people, but the thought form, the pendulum, the royal pendulum, starts to exert force into each individual to either yank that person back, to hook them with guilt or shame or at a duty or patriotism and say, but don't because you have to. Like, you can't doubt because what would your mother believe? What would your dad think of you if he knew that you were having doubts about the pendulum? And so you see people like pull each other back in, and that's not the individuals necessarily acting. Sometimes it can be, but in a large part, it's just that the pendulum itself, the larger royal grand pendulum that they've all kind of co-created, the entity that they've created by worshiping something bigger, is actually exerting energy into them and causing them to act this way. And so there's only really two ways you can go. At the edge of the pendulum, a pendulum is this umbrella energy that encircles the core believers. And anytime you're on the boundary level between either you can never really be halfway in or halfway out of a pendulum. The pendulum is going to do one of two things. It's either going to do everything it can to pull you back in, or it's going to recognize that allowing you to be just out is going to force you to be kicked out. So you get expelled or exiled from the pendulum. And both mechanisms are methods of control, and they don't come from the individual members. They come from the pendulum as a whole, as a grand royal structure. So that's the idea between a pendulum. Now, we talk about this idea of a pendulum can exert energy into a human and almost control their behavior. And there's a couple ways that it can do it. If we think of a pendulum, think of Christianity like a religious order as a large entity. Like Christianity is the person that they say it represents. Christianity being maybe it's an old man with a gray beard. That's like the image of God or Moses or something like that. So let's say that when you have enough people worshiping a God, that they co-create an invisible God that actually does exert energy back to them in a way. It's all esoteric kind of stuff. But how does that entity control the members? Well, this is where the vagus nerve comes in. Because if you look at the processes of the vagus nerve, what does the vagus nerve regulate from a felt sense perspective? When you are in a state of guilt or shame or fear, do you not viscerally feel it in your body? Do you not have a real wow, there is something gripping my stomach. It's pulling my throat. When you behave badly in a society or in a tribe, it's not that there's shame or guilt physically in the air. It's a social construct that latches or hooks into a target that is in need of being controlled, not according to the individual, but according to the collective body of people. So in a way, you could claim that the vagus nerve came about due to a need to enforce collectivized behavior. And that the vagus nerve there's an evolutionary pressure on humans to have developed the vagus nerve so that when we do something wrong, according to the tribe of people, it's all evolutionary. Go back 1,000,000 years, go back 200,000 years. It was all just a band of 50 people, maybe 1,000 people tops. You lose 20 of them to a woolly mammoth incident. You lose another 50 to a mutiny because they don't like the guy in charge, or they don't like the shaman, or they don't like the rules and they run off. You risk complete annihilation. And if you look back in the human history, if you look at the genetic history of humans, there was one point in time during the Ice Age, allegedly, that there were only 2,000 humans left on the entire planet. That's like the size of a maybe a large high school. Can you imagine? And it was probably similar ages too, because they didn't live a long time. Can you imagine all of human potential limited in a bottleneck down to just 2,000 high school kids wearing nothing more than wool hoods and leather moccasins and carrying sharp sticks with obsidian spears on the end of it, right? 2,000 of us. So if you didn't have mechanisms deep in your body that would respond to the leader or to something telling you, hey, get in line, don't run off, don't do anything stupid. It literally is life or death in that context. So humans developed this almost, I think that's kind of the origin story of why the vagus nerve was so successful in being a part of human development, is because it can regulate your empathy, how empathetic or compassionate you feel towards the ills of your group, of your tribe, of other people. why we feel love, why we feel belonging, why we feel socially interconnected with people, why we co-regulate. When I yawn, you yawn. When I smile, you smile. When I laugh, you laugh. There's this back and forth mirroring of behavior. And so there are there are lots of models that kind of help, that try their best to explain human development. Like there's polyvagal theory, which is one attempt to answer the question of where did the vagus nerve even come from? Who here knew that there's actually a field of study that's dedicated to just understanding, how the heck did we even get a vagus nerve in the first place? That's pretty remarkable, right? So it's very interesting that we don't even know how we got a vagus nerve. Hands down, I think that is interesting in and of itself. Now, polyvagal theory is a good attempt at answering that question. It's not a perfect attempt by any means, and it's certainly not, I don't even think it's close to being correct, but it's a great start. What I want to share with you is, now that we've kind of understood, now that you've gotten to the pendulum concept, now what I want to share is, since we've identified that, let's go back in history to before humans were even human, and let's go back even further, like 500 million years ago, to the ocean. And let's look at a similar template of a mammal or an amphibian, something that breathes with a heart, with a brain, with a tribe or a school of fish, for instance, amphibious creatures. Let's look at that. So in that context, let's try to understand what was a factor. So to be able to survive in the ocean as a fish, because I'm just going to accept that there's an evolutionary history between living human beings and fish, right? I don't know that for a fact. Pretty sure that happened. Okay, so we're going to start with that. We're going to suppose that humans have evolved from fish. Okay, at some point in time. Now, 500 million years ago, there were fish in the ocean. They needed to eat. They needed to reproduce. They needed to find shelter. They needed to, explore and flourish. Okay, they didn't have many concerns about internet and arguments and fighting each other. It was just basically, you float around like a fish and you're like, well, I'm in the water, right? So there's that activity. Now, there was a certain predator that had a real interesting taste, an acquired taste for fish and for shellfish and other kinds of crustaceans. And and I'm going to get a little gruesome here, okay? So we're going to go into something that is way weirder than even reality transurfing. So back then there were fish, and then there were also flatworms. And these flatworms that inside of their body, they contain a long nerve that looks just like the vagus nerve. So there were actually vagus nerves that existed in worms many, many hundreds of millions of years ago. And prior to that existing, in fish and those vertebrate amphibians, there was not a similar vagal nerve that existed to that degree. Trying to understand where the vagus nerve came from or how it developed the way it did is a very interesting problem. It's a conundrum. So basically what happened is that the Nemertea worm would hunt the fish. And in order to hunt a fish, the Nemertea would shoot out of its mouth, and actually kind of like out of its nose, what's called a proboscis. And this proboscis is a vagus nerve looking stringy goo that's like a neuron that latches onto its prey and then gives it a neurotoxin that calms the muscles down of the fish so the fish can't move. And then what happens is that the proboscis then helps to release digestive juices to start processing the fish. So that was 500 million years ago. It is very possible, and actually more likely than you think, that there was what's called parallel or translational evolution. And what happened was that in that constant back and forth interaction between the proboscis and the fish is that neurotoxin produced from the proboscis of the Nemertea worm was something that the fish craved. You know how, so in certain parts, I believe in Africa, in India, and maybe South America, there are certain trees that will ferment the fruit and drop the fruit to the ground. And all the animals from all around the entire jungle or whatever will run up to the tree and start eating this fermented fruit just so they can get a little drunk. And they've developed a habit around this. So while a Nemertea worm isn't trying to provide its proboscis as a delicacy to fish, but if you only half consume a proboscis successfully, then that proboscis can still exist inside of you and still produce that neurotoxin that calms down your nerves, calms down your muscles, and then actually helps to digest food, but from within the fish. And that becomes now a DNA latching point for the development of a much more advanced vagus nerve. So you could technically say that the vagus nerve developed by fish eating a naturally occurring vagus nerve in worms, which is crazy, absolutely insane. So yeah, that can explain the origin story behind the actual development of the vagus nerve. Truly. And if you don't believe that, consider this. We all have mitochondria, right? So we have mitochondria in your cells. So the mitochondria is not eukaryotic in origin. It didn't. Your cells back, billion years ago, did not contain mitochondria. Mitochondria was another separate organism completely that was adopted in whole by every cell in your body to generate electricity more efficiently from inside your body. So the whole concept that your body could potentially pick up a genetic feature and start growing something inside of our own body and co-opting it completely and saying, hey, live inside of me now, I want you, is not at all a strange concept. All of your cells are powered by that exact same function. So why wouldn't it be? Why isn't it possible? Why is it not possible that you could basically just take a feature that gets you kind of relaxed from a worm and ingest it and turn it into something that becomes of you? I also think it's kind of funny and interesting that in a lot of like sci-fi kind of weird, like counterculture art, maybe, or maybe a little bit horror kind of stuff, they always have this concept of like, think of the movie Alien. Alien from 1979 with Sigourney Weaver. I think it was directed by James Cameron, same guy who did Titanic and Avatar. So James Cameron, Alien, 1979. That film is about an alien creature that latches onto the mouth of people, sends a worm down its throat, and then it grows from within you, and then it kind of controls you. So there's something, I think, deeply psychologically embedded in human DNA of this idea of that we're almost like a bodily host to another foreign entity that does so much to us and for us. Now, another thing to consider. I was in a nice city last night eating some Indian food, and there was a gentleman that I was speaking to, and he was telling me about a hernia that he had. And the pain from a hernia that he had was so severe that he had a vasovagal syncope, which means that his body shut down. He passed out. Vasovagal syncope can also happen if you see blood for the first time. So if you see blood and you see something like a wound or something gory or gruesome, your body can actually shut you down. It also happens when animals in the wild are being attacked. So if there's an animal that is being attacked and under threat, sometimes that animal can actually freeze. Sometimes it's to play dead, but honestly, to the degree that an animal plays dead is it seems like too much, And think of it like this. If all human beings and all mammals have a proboscis nemertea vagus nerve in their bodies, then one animal eating another animal, in a sense, is like a nemertea worm eating another nemertea worm. So wouldn't it just benefit the nemertea worm proboscis vagus nerve that at some point one wouldn't fight back so much? Could humans be under the spell of a much larger force called the vagus nerve, more so than we think? So I think that touches on a very crazy topic and a crazy subject. That could even potentially lead into a topic of ideology, human ideology. How can humans become so good at hurting each other and doing this kind of stuff? It's shocking. It is truly shocking. So, anyway, I'm going to delete those links because I think they're causing some issues here. Delete. Yes. Wonderful. Yeah. Bum, 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 bum. Cool. Well, I guess that Facebook doesn't like the word reality transurfing or anything like that. So that could be what's happening. I don't really know. Maybe it's just not an interesting subject. But anyway, for the most part, if you were able to pay attention to that, I just dropped some pretty heavy duty stuff on your brain. I hope you're cool with that. I hope you're ready for that. Because once you start to see the world in that context, it can definitely change a lot for you. It can definitely shift a lot of your mindset in some powerful ways. Now, how can it change your mind in some powerful ways? Well, you realize that humans are we don't have as much agency as we think we do. So that's one thing you can take away from it. But again, I guess equally what I would say is there's nothing to take away from any of this. This is just a thought experiment, and nothing I said is true. Nothing I said matters at all. You've already basically forgotten everything that I've already said, and none of this will have any meaningful impact on the way you live your day-to-day life. It won't affect how you see other people. It won't affect what groups you get involved with. It won't have any more meaning to you than learning the rules of Monopoly. What are the rules of Monopoly? Who knows? Who cares? Are there rules to Monopoly? Yeah, and does it change how you play the game if you know the rules and the tricks and the secrets of the game of Monopoly? Yeah. But that doesn't apply here at all. So it's very different. It's very, very different. Very different thing. Yes, indeed. So good. Well, so let's wrap it up. So let's cover the main thing here. So for instance, the biggest, most badass thing that you need to know about is just how are you showing up to your day-to-day life, your reality, and what is happening on a day-to-day basis. I think that's pretty important. Wow. I'm so handsome. Look at me. Whoa. That's beautiful. Beautiful man. Beautiful face. Anyway, cool. All right. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to write it in the comment section. This is I will admit, some very out there content. We're talking about reality transurfing as a very esoteric subject, but I do believe that understanding reality transurfing is truly the key to understanding how the vagus nerve works. So if you want to understand how the vagus nerve really works, then you have to know, you can't just, to understand the vagus nerve is not possible to go directly at it. You have to go parallel and perpendicular to the vagus nerve in order to actually understand the vagus nerve. So you have to zig and zag. Jody, hey, good to see you. Thank you. Yeah, honestly, I think it's a rewatch video. You have to rewatch it from a little bit. This is a jam-packed video. Start from the 10-minute mark, right? And from the replay. But basically, key thing is, if you want to understand the nature of the vagus nerve, and I can tell you, I want to say, Lord of mercy, like that. I can tell you, Lord of mercy, that understanding the vagus nerve is a very rewarding time. It's a very rewarding place to put your time and effort. Has a lot of implications for how people live their lives, have their health, their relationships, and everything. So vagus nerve is very key. I don't particularly think Facebook likes the topic because it's definitely not letting people get in here. It's not giving any notifications to people, but it's fine. It happens. It's all good. I'll win out in the end. You just show up consistently enough and it'll work. But reality. Okay, so quick. I'll try to do this. I'm going to try, based on everything we talked about, I'm going to try to go through the quickest summary possible in less than 60 seconds. Okay? Reality transurfing is a spiritual, religious model for how the universe works at a fundamental level. Contained within the theory of reality transurfing is the theory explaining why when mass groups of humans get together and they worship a common idea, that the idea itself starts to exert energy back on the people, making them act in sometimes ways that seem really dumb or counterintuitive to the survival of the individual. But that's the law of pendulums. Now, the way that a pendulum controls a human being to get them to get back in line, to swing in with the rhythm of the collective pendulum, could be a religion, a cult, a business, a sports team, anything where people kind of collect and cohese around a core vision, goal, value system, is a pendulum. No exceptions. The pendulums use the vagus nerve to exert control over human behavior. That's why if you don't master your vagus nerve, somebody else has already mastered it for you. And they do it through music, through patriotism, through duty, through guilt, through shame, through fear, through addictions, through food, through music, through lyrics. There's lots of ways that the pendulums try to hook into you and control your behavior. And that's a direct byproduct of how pendulums form. It's called the madness of crowds in other contexts, in a psychological context. It's a very well understood phenomenon. When massive crowds of people get together and they create mobs, that mob of people looks like its own entity. Like if you ever seen those birds that fly around and they look not like a single bird anymore, they look like this big ebbing and flowing single organism floating around in the sky. That's the same concept that explains human behavior, mass emergent processes from very small individualized collections of multiple things, of small complex things stacked together a million times can emerge to have evolving, emergent, really almost intelligent looking properties. And that form, that form of the swallows now becomes its own thing, as if the form itself is now exerting control over the birds and what decisions they make. And you don't want to be a bird who's flying straight outside of the big orb, the ball of birds, because you'll feel guilty, shame, or you'll feel some visceral reaction to go, oh my God, have you ever felt out of place? If you're in a group of people and you walk outside of the group, do you immediately feel like, oh, I'm doing something wrong? I feel embarrassed, shame, guilt, fear, something like that. That is what we're talking about. And so if you want to understand the vagus nerve, you have to understand the vagus nerve not directly. You have to understand it through some parallel models of explaining human behavior. So that's the first key thing. Now the next key thing is uprooting polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory is an attempt to answer the question, how and why did the vagus nerve even exist in the first place? And that is I think is a very important question. I think it's remarkable and commendable that Stephen Porges set out to create even a theory of, hey, there is a thing called the vagus nerve. It doesn't follow any other kind of nerve in our body. It's something weird. There is something unique, certainly, about the vagus nerve, given that it's almost a single nerve. It's the most massive individual nerve in the body. It's a continuous nerve, and it connects to basically every major organ in your entire body. And it has so many implications for your emotional health, your inflammatory health, your physical health, your metabolism. The list goes on. And if you have it, great. If you don't have a vagus nerve, life is pretty miserable. So he was like, well, where did this thing come from? Is there an evolutionary history that we can look into to define where did the vagus nerve come from? And his theory is that there was, that's an interesting question, actually, now that I think of it. His theory was that always was the mechanism for the vagus nerve, but then it became, I don't even think that's right, actually, now that I think of it. In polyvagal theory doesn't even explain where the vagus nerve physically even came from, why there would be a vagus nerve in the first place. I think that's kind of interesting. I had the opportunity last night to go, well, maybe, obviously with his consent, but apparently Porges is somewhere in my neck of the woods, let's say. So I have the potential to maybe meet this guy. If you've known me long enough, that would be a meeting of the minds for sure. I think that would be very interesting. I do hope at some point that could happen. Maybe I'll manifest it. What do you think? But polyvagal theory doesn't even really explain how the vagus nerve physically got there in the first place. It just explains it tries to explain why the vagus nerve seems to be important for human safety, psychology, breathing, regulation of the body. All kinds of stuff are attempted to be explained in this way. Okay, so I'm having an idea here. You know how they say that fish have like a 3-minute memory, right? We always think of goldfish with these very short-term memories. What do animals that lived before fish, what are their memories like? And how did fish go from 3-minute memories to longer memories? What was the missing piece? I would argue here that the vagus nerve is what gave fish post-vagus nerve insertion. And I am going to argue here that the vagus nerve was an external creature, in a sense, that went into a fish and took hold. So if you really want a quick summary, is that the vagus nerve is not some kind of divine, God-given miracle nerve. The vagus nerve, in fact, is a foreign intruder that latched into our body for good reason, with our own choice, right? Anybody watching, is there a religious thought? Is there a religious school of thought that talks about early creatures eating something that changed them, that was like a snake of some sort? Is there any kind of like origin story about humans gaining memory that had to do with the consumption of something from a snake, like a Vegas looking kind of thing? I don't know. Does a snake kind of represent a vagus nerve, or a dragon? If you look at the medical caduceus, the caduceus staff that Mercury holds, are those not intertwining snakes going up to an acorn? And doesn't that explain, like, there's some origin story with snakes, I think. And, I'm being glib, but yeah, I know the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. I'm even thinking further back than that in other kinds of things, because I think, oh, cool. Jody, this is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this. I want to read this here. So according to the Sumerians, the Anunnaki, people say lizard people, created us using science and the earth animals. Okay, so that's very interesting. Okay, so hear me out. And I know all these, I do know these theories, thank goodness. Jody, you're awesome. Thank you so much. This is great. Hey, if we only got a couple people watching this, and I said at the very beginning, this is like information that only a few people will even be able to even grasp at all. I'm just going high level stuff here. Okay. So what if in that context so there's an origin story about the crossing of different species. Now we know that, so let's take mitochondria. Mitochondria have different DNA than human cells. And so we know that mitochondria were a single-celled organism that existed completely outside of animal cells. But an animal cell went, oh wow, look at that thing. That makes energy really, really easily with a little bit of sugar. I'm going to go over there and suck up the mitochondria to become my own internal powerhouse and create it as I need it. So your cells already co-opted an already existing piece of nanomolecular technology. So it's not that far off to say that the same thing couldn't have also happened in the context of the vagus nerve too. Because the only existing theory that I know of on planet Earth that has even attempted to explain something with the origin of the vagus nerve is polyvagal theory. And that doesn't even touch on how did the vagus nerve physically get there in the first place. And did you know, so here's another thing. So anatomically, when the brain is developing, so think of like an embryo. Now it's a zebrafish. We're not talking about a human embryo. We're talking about zebrafish specifically. And I do have pictures in the Facebook group on look, if you later on you can look up zebrafish and you can see they charted the vagus nerve, how there are a few neurons that grow in the brain stem, and those are the ganglion of the vagus nerve. And then once the body develops, that the neurons of the vagus nerve start descending all the way down, all the way through very tightly compacted holes. And the vagus nerve knows exactly to go left and then right and then go through a hole and then wrap around here and then there and then latch onto here and there and there. So the vagus nerve goes from your like a couple of neuron cells in your brain to descending all the way through your entire body, and it knows exactly where to go at the right time in the right place. So the vagus nerve is really advanced, really, really, really advanced. So who knows? I mean, could be, There's a lot of mythology with these kinds of origin stories, like the Sumerians and the Anunnaki, and if we're created. I mean, I guess the next question you have to ask is, well, if humans needed to be created in that way, then who created the Anunnaki, and who created the Sumerians, and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's kind of, how many steps back do you go till you go, okay, well, something naturally had to develop, it couldn't have just been. And then if we're in a simulation, who's the person running the simulation? How did they come to be? So, that's kind of an endless question. Practically what we can say is that there is some compelling evidence that shows that the vagus nerve never was a natural part of our ancestors 500 million years ago. That the vagus nerve was something that we saw out in the wild as literally like a swimming kind of tentacle-like white object, that if you ate it, it would emit a neurotoxin that would calm your nerves down, that would relax your nerves. Sort of the same way, look, is there a piece of plant or animal material that grows in the wild that could kill you in a high enough dosage, but at a low enough dosage can get you high, and that humans consume this all the time and have for almost all of human recorded history? That humans go out of their way to farm a plant that has a nicotinic, acetylcholinergic activation to calm you down. Yeah, if you're like, tobacco? Yes. So us human mammals, already in our day-to-day society, go out of our way to harvest and get that exact neurotoxin that calms us down. So if you see someone who's a smoker, you know for a fact that that person smoking is trying to stimulate their vagus nerve chemically. So how crazy would it be to say that when we were fish and we were hunting around, that there's a type of worm that fish eat called the Nemertea that has what's called the proboscis, and it will shoot this proboscis out of its mouth. It's the exact size of its body. This thing can be 10 feet long. It can be 3 feet long. It's crazy. It can detach from the actual worm itself and live externally inside of its prey as it emits the neurotoxin that works on the acetylcholinergic system. And then we'll technically eat it from the outside in. So if we have mitochondria that are external and we said, oh, I want that. Just explain to me, if this is such a crazy idea, how did humans end up with mitochondria that have mRNA that's not DNA at all? It's not human DNA. It didn't come from us. We didn't create it. mRNA from mitochondria did not originate inside of your own cells, but somehow we're grown and our cells reproduce, and we know how to encode an entirely different species DNA. Your cells can re-encode a factory component from an entirely different species if it wanted to. So you're telling me that we only ever did that once ever? That it couldn't have been possible that we did that with the vagus nerve? Get the fuck out of here. No, there is no other theory that can explain that particular parallel transfer of evolution. Also, this is well known. Spider silk. Apparently, spiders didn't develop silk naturally, and they ate it from worms. Whoa. So spiders got some of the production factory for silk for their webs by eating worms. And that's how spiders are able to weave silk, which is another web. So how many things have mammals and insects received as parallel transfer items that are web-like from worms? So there's certainly, and probably, I don't know, I'm going to make If first time's a charm, second time's a charm, third time's a charm, I'm going to hypothesize without even knowing for a fact that mitochondria was transferred to animal cells from worms also. Fish got the vagus nerve from sea worms. Spiders got the web silk from silkworms. Spiders got that DNA component, that DNA snippet from silkworms. And that even earlier mitochondria came from probably worms. That's my guess. I guess worms have a lot of transferable, components. It's very interesting. And the vagus nerve, I think, is actually a worm-specific thing. That's what I think. So anyway, but cool. Joe, do you have another comment? So they say of Star Wars and other sci-fi shows, maybe aliens are more of a documentary. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, who knows? It's really, it's an out there question. I will say that on the question of the aliens, there was an interview with Elon Musk, and regardless of what you think of the guy, he had a good point. He said, do you think that our space protection agency, our U.S. military, if they had any real direct evidence of an outside alien force, that they wouldn't immediately tell the public and say, we need all the funding we can because these things are going to try to kill us? I think that they have every incentive as the military to convince humans that there are aliens and that we should, have the most powerful military might in the world. That would be like front page news all the time. You'd have full control of humans if there were really aliens floating around. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Who knows? But you have another comment here. So here's the thing. I have heard that if you have hiccups, okay, say I am no longer a fish, I am human, and the hiccups stop and it works, would there be a vagal connection with this? Wow. I mean, yeah, there would be. So hiccups are a vagal response. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. I am no longer a fish, I am human. And also, your vagus nerve is what lets you speak. So, are there any worms that can speak? I'm just going to Google this, guys. Singing worms. Is there such a thing as a singing worm? Doesn't look like. Okay, singing worms. I'm just trying to figure out, how did we get speech from worms? Do worms speak? Researchers have found that they can communicate with each other by using touch and taste. They can feel vibrations in the soil so they can avoid predators. There's even evidence to suggest that they like to travel in herds and follow a leader. So you have advanced social behavior in worms. Polyvagal theory suspects that the vagus nerve, the proboscis really, is what gave human beings the ability to develop complex hierarchies with a leader. Apparently worms are doing it too. But polyvagal theory completely negates the possibility that anything previous to like an eel or a monkey or a rabbit or a rat has a vagus nerve, essentially. Until polyvagal theory says there was no such thing as a functioning vagus nerve until you got to rats. That somehow rats developed the vagus nerve and fish didn't. Even though there's evidence that fish and eels have vagus nerves, but not for their whole history, only about 500 million years ago did the emergence of the actual vagal type of structures happen. Yeah, okay. So years ago, I had a dream linking my healing to nematodes. Yes. And so nematodes would be these type of worms. Absolutely. And yeah, nematode roundworms, those are sort of related to the same thing. Let's see, nematodes, proboscis. I'm going to do this. I hope you're not squeamish. I can't play any video, but I can put a thumbnail here on YouTube. And if you look carefully at that thumbnail, you can see a worm on the left and a white stringy thing shooting out. That is the proboscis. It comes right out of their mouth. It grows from all the way from their groin. It goes through their body. It's not part of their digestion. It's separate from the digestion. You can cut it. It'll regrow. You can cut the human vagus nerve and it will also regrow. That specific proboscis that's released produces a neurotoxin that is at low concentrations desirable because it causes somewhat of a modulation in energy. It's calming. It's a relaxing thing. It's a soothing neurotoxin. It's just like tobacco. So I think it's more likely than not that fish were hunting for the proboscis, and then eventually they had enough of that exposure to it that they just laterally transferred the proboscis from the Nemertea worm, and that's called the Nemertea. I'll get you the link for that. Nemertea ribbon. Yeah, it's a ribbon worm too. I don't know if I can share. Let me try this. If I copy the image address and I paste this here, does that work? No, it's a redirect notice. Sorry, give me a second. I might be able to share like the actual link to the picture of this type of worm. Copy image address, paste it here. So at least maybe you could see the... Okay, so you kind of can see it, but you can see that is a worm with a proboscis, and that proboscis is called that's called the Nemertea, phylum Nemertea. So it's very similar to a nematode, and here's what they would say: if you want to heal your body, you heal your vagus nerve, which is basically was worm food. Well, was fish food. Worms are fish food, and the vagus nerve was fish food, and then the vagus nerve the fish became the host body for the Nemertea proboscis, and the rest is history. So there you go. That's the origin of the vagus nerve. Very simple. And there's also the Nemertea worm is the 12th most abundant type of creature on the planet. There's 1,200 types of Nemertea. They exist in every corner of the planet. So you could have parallel evolution just explode intelligence. And then remember I said, why do some fish have 3 minutes of memory? But in humans or mammals, when we have longer memories, it's called the cholinergic memory system. In order to have long-term memory, you have to have a cholinergic system. The Nemertea's proboscis is a cholinergic system. The vagus nerve is also your cholinergic system. If you cut the vagus nerve, you can lose emotional memory. If you transfer a heart, which includes vagal nerve fibers, into the chest of another person, that person can feel the same emotions, have the same desires, wants, needs, tastes, musical tastes as the person that the heart came from. So is that transference of the vagus nerve fibers of the memory from that person? I don't know. But crazy stuff, folks. Anyway, I'm going to put a link in the chat for Facebook. We're going to end it here on YouTube. I'm going to end the video for YouTube. Thanks, guys, for watching. Hope this blew your mind a little bit. And I'll see you soon. Take care. Boom.